Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art and culture, and now it's the last of the big ones, the top 50 best albums of 2021. I've described lists like this like a professional obligation before. The final one to check off, the big one where I rattle through all the albums where given that they're slightly larger bodies of music, you can't always have the same in-depth personal connection and compare with individual songs. And when you look at a list of this size, god damn it, there was a part of me that felt like it could very well feel like a professional obligation just putting it all together. It's a lot of work. And yet, while it is always a lot of work going through all the projects in my catalog to see what order makes sense for this specific brief window of time, I'm still inordinately proud that I got a solid 50 albums here that I think are great and are worth this shout out. Given that I covered slightly less than the 350 plus I reviewed back in 2020, I was a little bit concerned I wouldn't have enough quality to really flesh out this list, but turns out having a stiff veto and a sharper eye for digging in the weirder parts of the internet gave me a wealth of material. And yeah, all the genres delivered. Even metal managed to sneak in some great surprises across the year to go with rock having an uncommonly strong showing of all genres. But I will say this now, this might be the last year in which some keen-eyed viewers can adequately or completely predict how this entire list falls out, due to some changes on the channel to come. Unless of course you saw my Up Rocks ballad a month ago, which in that case, stay tuned for what could have possibly changed. You never know. But alright, we're keeping things a little bit shorter for the first half, no promises, with the top 25 going into a little bit more depth, so let's start off with... I bet those of you who didn't watch my ASMR ambient episode on the Pulse, you don't recognize what this is. Although a surprising number of you did, of which I'm still a little bit perversely impressed. Anyway, Grandbrothers are a piano-driven electronic duo who dabble in the most soaring, post-rock-esque style of ambient music. And this album was remarkably beautiful, from front to back. Just this crystalline adventure and gleaming sound design that remains one of the most engaging, ambient-leaning projects that I heard all year. I can easily recommend this to folks who are even on the fence about this subgenre. It is that pretty. And even if it sprawls a little bit more than you might expect, it is still quite special.
Would you feel, would you empathize with words that come from me if all of our systems were gone? If you're wondering how, I'll let you see.
So I don't normally segregate EPs into their own list, mostly because I don't think I cover enough of them throughout the course of the year, and the length of the projects, either in number of songs and time, is completely fucking arbitrary, and that means Moron Police's little western diversion winds up on this list, where the bleakness is a little bit more obvious, but the melodic compositions are still so manic, still so well balanced, it's hard for me to care. Now this group has described this project as a bridge to whatever they might do next. And while I'm not sure it's got the spark that their synth-driven work really does, when the tunes hit this hard, I think I'm still gonna get down on the floor.
These hinterlands are my own. They mountain myth gonna see. This old dog will still hunt. I don't need no feather bed. I'm spry as the moon. I won't even break a sweat.
This is one of those albums you'll remember more for the off-the-wall details and poetry than anything else. Provided, of course, you actually heard it, given that this is an acoustic indie country affair that I found months after it had already been released early in 2021. But it was the sort of album that kept pulling me back in with the uncompromising poetry and the flair for taking those who live deep down in the back roads and daring you to sympathize and understand their faith and their struggles. Definitely shaggier and rougher than anything Pony Bradshaw had cut before now, but really all the more real for it. Another gem, you're gonna want to check it out.
I take that. What you gonna do with all that? Tell your homeboy to fall back. Tell your girlfriend to fall back. Come on and just bounce. I take that. What you gonna do with all that? Tell your homeboy to fall back. Tell your girlfriend to fall
Yeah, this one did seem to come and go remarkably fast. If I think I had a little bit more of a chance to spend time outside or actually gone to any parties this summer, this might have grown on me more, but Canada was a lot slower to open things up this year, and thus Emotional Orange's album/mixtape basically fell here. And yeah, it's more scattered, and I'm not sure they made the most of the influx of guest stars, and I'm seriously starting to wonder if their central formula might be coasting and they may have missed their window to break through. But I mean, come on. When the grooves are this slick and the vibes are this fun, I'm still taking notice. So this is the latest of possible entries on this list, and why I reckon you shouldn't place that much stock in the placement, given that these orders are really just how I feel within a specific window of time, and they can easily fluctuate. But Ethereal Shroud slid in with a monster of a symphonic black metal project, one that didn't just win me over with the furious compositions and the impeccable transitions, and just how well they could actually balance their slower doom elements, but also where the emotional drama and the content felt visceral and righteous. This is a project waging war not just against the crumbling strictures of modern society, but also against one's own nihilism, where it'd be so easy to succumb to broader cynicism, and yet in weathering the storm, he refuses. Not exactly an easy listen given the genre and the track lengths, but if you give this enough time, yeah, this was the end of the year rallying cry I absolutely needed.
Comes a time when we will reap what we have sown. Sooner or later we all have to go.
Turns out the best way to reinvigorate a long-running punk band is actually go back to the independent circuit, get your best production in decades, and then refine that righteous formula a little bit further for a furious comeback that nobody saw coming. Those who just said that this was Rise Against playing to the formula, I gotta say, you missed the details. Yeah, they paint in broad strokes and might be saying things that we already know, but with this much power and populism and the most sinuous, punchy grooves and hooks they've had in years, Rise Against prove not only how their message is still relevant, but how they can still sell it with a lot of fervor and firepower. This was a comeback I don't think anybody saw coming, and not enough people gave the proper attention, but you know what? I gotta give them props for actually landing it.
If I could, I would say all I left unsaid.
So if you were in the know, if there was a genre that seemed like it was overtaking 2021, it was post-punk infused, off-kilter experimental rock. And while there's going to be some of it on this list because a lot of it was really damn good, I think this was the album that was slept on the most. Most because really From are a little bit closer to emo and post-hardcore in a lot of their compositional structures. Even if the integration of jazz and horns shows just how well they can play in this territory. But this is an album where the writing does a lot of heavy lifting, telling the Asian immigrant story not just with respect to a world that can treat them with disinterest, fetishization, or outright hostility, but also the family expectations to now fit into that introduce a whole new set of complicated burdens that really From unpack impressively well. For anybody who puts Black Midi and Squid and Shame on a pedestal in 2021, I would show them this. I think they'd appreciate it.
Don't step it down once you know what you gotta do. Ain't no stopping now, cause we know what we gotta do. Feeling the waves that might seem random.
Yep, she did it. Capping off a trilogy of sinuous, low-key R&B, Dominique Fils-Aime dropped a record that looks both backwards and forwards, integrating old-school soul and jazz progressions, all the while pushing towards a worldview that feels more global, textured, and centered around a healing journey that's all the more necessary. Absolutely a slow burn like the previous projects in her catalog, and I still think lyrically I like her 2019 sophomore album a little bit more, but Three Little Words is a conscious, comforting listen that had remarkable staying power for me. An easy sell for anyone who likes the most tasteful of R&B, but who will stick around for the details, and they'll reveal the light.
You couldn't save me, but
but you can't let me go.
Yeah, this is here, and I'd argue it's better than her debut. Across the board. In discussing Happier Than Ever, I've heard it described as a bit of a sampler platter, dabbling in a bunch of different ideas that Billie, Eilish, and Phineas wanted to explore, which is one reason why its pace feels often so oddly languid and it's a little bit all over the place. But dig a little bit deeper, you start hearing those underlying thematic connections, the impeccable transitions across all the ideas, and Billie Eilish showcasing a wisdom surrounding her newfound power and influence within a bad breakup in a world eager to eat her alive that once again showcases her boundless potential. Even if I know deep down in my gut we're probably going to get far fewer albums from Billie Eilish than we'll probably want. No, stans and chart watchers. This was never Billie's flop era, just the point where she expects you to work a little bit harder to keep up. And you really should. The music rewards it.
Many sleepless nights, the panic that rewinds, waiting for the sunrise as paradise arrives.
I've actually been up and down on this album all year. Yeah, Omega's a tour de force, another incredibly powerful conclusion to a trilogy that might stand as one of Epica's best ever projects, not just with production that actually finally puts them in the A-list of symphonic metal, but also how their writing untangles and explores faith and spiritualism in the face of all these endings. One of the most fiercely intelligent and irrationalist metal bands, then confronting the unknown, makes for quite the cinematic adventure, and it's a lot of fun. But at the same time, it's a bit of a behemoth that can be kind of tough to approach in its entirety, and I'll admit I didn't quite go back to it as often as I would have liked. The hooks didn't quite have the same staying power, but still, phenomenal release. I was thrilled to see Epica finally get some overdue praise, and then set the bar for anyone who actually dares challenge it. Great stuff.
Folks say I'm difficult, too stubborn. It's funny, I'm real easy. Yeah, I'm bugging.
You know, the funny thing with this project is that Aesop Rock and Blockhead, they've been working together for decades already. Formalizing it for a full project, that just feels like gravy, especially as Blockhead can give our rapper the most comfortable production and mixing and mastering that he's had in years. But even beyond that, while Spirit World Field Guide last year was dreamlike, went down a lot of weird tangents, Garbology is a little bit more grounded in sifting through all the wreckage, where Aesop Rock has adapted well enough for a changing world to persist, or at least keep on transforming within it, but that doesn't seem to be all that good for everyone else that's still down here. In either case, the wordplay is so wildly creative, the hooks might be sharper than ever, not so much dumpster diving, more turning trash into treasure. So this is the hardcore album that everyone lost their minds about this year, eh? Okay, I'm not about to disagree. Turns out adding a bunch of fluttery touches dabbling in pop and psychedelic R&B won't just give you some of your strongest ever hooks, but also a textural diversity that really helps your album stand out and actually cross over. Not quite as unique as many have made it out to be. Hardcore has had its pop dalliances before, but hey, when you got lyrics that seem acutely aware of that coming unknown and a fervent desire to hold on to the visceral now, Turnstile were able to erupt across the scene and feel crushing and immediate in the best way possible. Hit the pit. This kicks ass.
They say you gotta stop crying all the time. And they say you gotta stop crying all the time.
Really? Are you all honestly surprised about this one? Yeah, a YouTuber followed off of her underrated pop debut with an even better pop rock project that showcases not just a unique voice and a lyrical style, but also how she can throw down with any of them working in this lane right the hell now. Emma Blackery is a lot more of an interesting artist than she's often been given credit, and here she complexifies a lot of the darkness in her writing to expose more frustrated and layered humanity, where she's consciously aware of her audience and will actually punch back at them, often justifiably so. Coupled with production and compositional instincts that are both taking a measurable step forward, yeah, Emma Blackery is becoming a force to be reckoned with. Y'all should take notice.
And we won't get to anywhere anytime this year, darling.
Yeah, this was another album that was up and down all over this list. Hell, I said that 6 months ago at the mid-year. You find it slipping out of your mind, and then find yourself wondering whether it was actually really that great, and then you re-listen to it and realize, yes, it absolutely was. Look at the pedigree. And while a more robust arrangement could have made this a Bad Seeds album proper, Nick Cave and Warren Ellis still managed to put out one of their most immediate and timely projects in years, where the meta text intersects with a lot of the socially charged commentary, and Nick Cave questioning his own place and relevancy as he clings to a marriage that might actually be fraying. Absolutely an uncanny listen, but hey, when it's this great, I'm not about to complain.
You want to set out for the cities, turning green, but I want to stay up all night.
Look, please, let's not make the placement of this album on this list a bigger deal than it actually is. Yeah, Spelling made a gorgeous genre-blending album that bends across Baroque pop, R&B, progressive rock, and plenty more. Easily her best album to date, even if I think some of the tangents don't quite fully come together, and not all the tunes or production quite work for me, and she absolutely wears the Kate Bush influence on her sleeves. But I mean, so what? Spelling's album is tangled and transcendent in a way that very few are. I'm still amazed how much of this she put together, so much of this in-house just by herself, and this is an album that defies easy quantification. I mean, that's kind of what magic does. I gotta respect that.
Woke up on the West Coast for the first time in my life. Drove cross country, but I remember those flights. Genuflected when I heard the weed price. White boys with the weed pipes. Sunny days, sunny nights. Mighty clouds and northern lights. I was always bright, so no sooner than we touched down, I'm seeing how we could get home and be right.
Not gonna lie, this one actually cooled on me a little bit. And while a certain beef with another artist on this list might have contributed a little to that, Haram was always gonna be a complicated album to really discuss and unpack. A collaboration with the Alchemist that gives Billie Woods and Elusive their most accessible production to date, the questions of how to communicate and explore success within the system that they openly distrust, guest verses that only seem to add a lot more complicating wrinkles by exploring the messy humanity that will come along even through communicating some of this in code in plain sight. Look, I'm honestly not sure how I feel about it in comparison with some other Armand Hammer projects as well. I still think I like Billie Woods' solo a little bit more, and I don't think this is going to touch Rome or Paraffin, but success gives the duo an interesting, sweetened situation to work with, and with even more momentum now behind them, I am kind of fascinated where they go next. But hell, this was great too. It's dense, but it's worth it.
Ain't nothing in this town that hasn't been shut down or soon to be headed that way. But it all dies in the end, so what's it matter anyway?
And I think at some point I was nearly about to skip this album, a sort of acoustic indie country project that can easily slip out of sight, out of mind, until you go back to it and you realize not just how burnished and layered the arrangements are, but also just how well Cole Chaney can paint those coal-ravaged Kentucky hills, and then being pulled in between chasing dreams in a place that is not his own, or his own place being torn away beneath him. It's raw, almost to a fault, certainly a tough listen, divorced from any sort of label streamlining. Cole Chaney's Mercy nevertheless stands out as a really sharp, well-composed, heartfelt, and frankly another underground gem you just gotta blast away to find. It's worth the excavation. Check it out. Somehow I wound up as among the most vocal praising this album, but I guess I'm going to keep on doing it, because this is Xiu Xiu's most compelling and accessible work in decades. It's a project where this group is just as dark, deviant, sexually charged, but smart enough to make it weird and disquieting in fascinating ways, but also immensely quotable and just frequently really funny, with production that can bend their gothic and baroque sensibilities until they fracture and snap. But frankly, when you bring so many other voices into the room, it serves as a moment of temperance from Jamie Stewart's hangdog nihilism, tug him back away from the brink. Hell, maybe even rekindle some of the romance that's made Xiu Xiu's best album so striking for me. Or hell, you know what, maybe he's just embracing a few of those hooks that Xiu Xiu has casually ignored over the years, when that ragged magic can strike yet again, and the oh no turns into oh god yes.
So cold, it feels so cold inside chains. When I look so cold, it feels so cold inside chains.
Now, this one kept growing on me all damn year. Yeah, the synth and the staccato grooves, they still aren't all the way there for me, but Genesis Owusu is such an elastic and remarkable performer, leaping across hip-hop, R&B, soul, and even electronic rock, where I was stunned just how well he could command every single stage. And it wasn't just that the hooks, they were great, and the transitions, they were masterful, but the content took major strides as well, drilling into a lot of self-hatred and depression alongside the societal conditions that might drive and then profit off of those emotions, embracing all the racial subtext and giving the album a layered but no less bristling and bruising impact. The fact this is a debut, it's mind-blowing. Genesis Owusu has indicated just how blazing bright his future might be, where every chain will be broken.
Trying to find the right loophole in Glasgow. Pulled up in the Peugeot, stepped out. Drip like Inspector Clouseau. Puff some hot breath on the Hublot, if only. Binary consciousness, errant pompousness. Shaka Zulu's verse, Clarence Thomas's. At that time, I was trafficking in airy promises. Hustling the margin of error can be an accomplishment.
Oh yeah, he took the leap. God damn, he finally took that leap, that next step, and R.A.P. Ferreira delivered one of his best albums to date. His second of this year, and one that nobody seems to have actually remembered actually came out, and to some it feels a little bit more conventional in an instrumental palette that pulls more on jazz or blues. And sure, when the grooves are this good and you get a few hooks to match all the poetry, that certainly helps, but the poetry is where R.A.P. Ferreira really stepped up, taking his sly postmodernist lens not just to how he sidesteps a lot of definition and then plays an abstraction, but also to mock the capitalist hip-hop landscape, where he increasingly realizes the whole sense of emptiness of all those accolades that he once chased, even if there is a part of him that still yearns for that recognition still. And it wasn't just the wider angle that really won me over, it was just how much less standoffish he seems to be this time around, especially as the late MF Doom influences feel a lot more prominent, and he embraces a much more playful self-awareness that's got a lot of charm, at least to me. So yeah, still might be wordy and tangled and plenty weird, but this time it was a lot more fun. Y'all should actually get some time, hear it.
I wanna show you why I can keep it all together. Wanna try nothing but to deserve you.
So this project wound up as way more contentious than I think anyone expected. Yeah, it might have been a slight step back compared to Near My God, but it was done in favor of the band's catchiest and most accessible songs to date in a lean, effective package that nevertheless managed to rip your heart out, as if it seemed like everything was going wrong for Foxing and they still found ways to persist. And yet as a result, the band got savaged by a certain critical set, which just felt disingenuous, especially for a band in the throes of changing labels and having to find a new distributor, and yeah, you know, the utter chaos of the past couple of years. And this entirely harrowing listen still managed to capture that mood distinctly, while also displaying some of the most refined and focused compositions of Foxing's career. Might be a minor step back, but for emo-tinged pop rock, this was still excellent.
Sweet country music, where have you gone? Sweet country music, please come back home.
Yeah, you know, sometimes the old stalwarts deliver in spades. It had been 6 years since a new Alan Jackson album, and then he delivered the weightiest double album of his career in response. And while it might be kind of easy to dismiss it as just another Alan Jackson project, this man's been consistent to a fault for pretty much over 30 years. But when the writing is this heartfelt, the production remains this refined, and Alan Jackson remains one of the most comfortable, empathetic personalities in country, mainstream or otherwise, it's really hard to go astray. Perhaps a little bit long, tilting a little bit conservative for certain younger audiences, but as someone who grew up on this stuff and has got no qualms putting Alan Jackson on my year-end list before, yeah, one of his best in many years.
I'm more than adequate. Leave Kanye out of this. Leave your sertraline in the cabinet and burn what's left of all the cards you kept.
So remember when I was talking about post-punk adjacent experimental rock erupting onto the scene in 2021? Yeah, this was the best of it, and Black Country New Road made it very clear there'd be an immediate force to be reckoned with this debut album. The wildly cinematic compositions and the production that gave them all this space and texture to operate all across the genre diversions, this thick cushion of meta commentary that merged amazingly well with all their theatricality and bombast, all which supplemented an anxiety-racked piece that explores generational privilege, self-sabotage, and the ability to build anything out of the wreckage if you even can. And the fact that this band is already saying they've got another album coming around the corner this year, yeah, we should be in for something special, and you'll want to catch up and take notice. Oh, thank the higher powers, Church's managed to rebound with their best album in years. And what I really appreciate here isn't just the corrective steps that Church's took in bringing the production back in-house, but also how they didn't feel the need to recycle the exact same relationship arc of their first two albums, instead using a lot of horror movie iconography and drawing on some of the trappings of goth rock to dig into some of the paralyzing fears and neuroses preventing that band from breaking out of their shells in the first place, where of their own minds can be greater bulwarks than the larger world itself. But for the first time, Churches sounds like they're actually breaching their comfort zone, and they're looking to sweep into some uncharted territory for this synth-pop group, and yet with compositional fundamentals as rock solid as ever, this was a return to greatness that was so welcome to behold. Nice to have this brand of violence back.
To run.
So this was the year where I finally really got on board with Brandi Carlile's solo work. Yeah, I know I'm late to the party, but in all due fairness, this might be one of the best places to get on board anyway, as she embraced a lot more wild, flavorful pivots, dabbling across Americana and even Southern rock, with Dave Cobb maintaining that textured foundation for her just simply incredible voice. But what I think won me over most here on this album, it's the writing. Brandi Carlile does have one of the most uniquely expressive voices in alternative country, that's well known, but what I appreciated here was just how creative she is in stretching out her imagery into both werewolves and biblical apocrypha, while still having the capacity to rip your heart out along the way with her soft-focused ballads like few others. Now this album does not seem to have received the same level of attention as By the Way I Forgive You. I don't know why. Well, if that project might be a little bit more refined, this is more experimental and colorful and interesting, and frankly the hooks are better too. But it did convince me that, be it on her own or with the Highwomen, Carlile has all my attention going forward. Keep it up. And that's the first half of this list. Now on to the slightly meatier entries for the top half. Number 25. You know, when it comes to albums that I find on Bandcamp randomly, I'm used to feeling like I'm the only one talking about them. There's gonna be a bunch on this list. But with this band, where I feel like I'm 3 albums late to the party, yeah, no excuse for this to be so ignored.
And I'm staring at the sun, tripping into the void. I don't mind it down here, nothing left to avoid. Everybody says that they want some. I am getting sick of people talking so much. Hold me underwater, not afraid of drowning. The light is everywhere.
Now, on some level, I'm not really surprised that this album might have been ignored or would have the feel of being tainted to some audiences. The band fired their founding bassist after allegations came out a month before this project was released, and along with a pretty considerable shift in the sound, the band might be in a rocky place for the foreseeable future. Kind of a shame because this project absolutely rules, and it came with amplifying everything that made them great in the first place. The guitars are meatier, they drive a much heavier melodic groove. The pop elements, they only accentuate that warped psychedelic crunch. Their production remains some of the best in this brand of indie rock and alternative rock, and even the content nails the balance between trying to repair the mess and then overcorrecting to then spiral out of control, even if they all had the best of intentions. Slothrust is a band that could have very easily imploded in 2021, with this album feeling so much like the desperate struggle to hold anything together as the world burns around them, and yet it's probably their best in years. You probably missed this, amidst all the controversy. Still worth hearing. Number 24. This is one of those albums that dropped late and surprised me. A collaboration where I didn't know one of the long-running bands, and the other person was a singer-songwriter with whom I have had the most mixed opinions. So this turning out to be a moment of greatness, lightning in a bottle.
How we are lost, back to the half-light, telling our guts why we'll have to believe in fat teardrops roll off the bluffs of our cheekbones.
What I think works best about Circle working with Richard Dawson is how the band gives him the one thing that he's never consistently had: foundation. It's a weird foundation rooted in folk and proto-metal of the late 60s and early 70s, but with robust underlying grooves and terrific balance in the cycling progressions and the hooks, it gave Richard Dawson the earth to plant his seeds of this odd naturalistic exploration of plant life, ancient myths, and human entropy, the last of which has been his bread and butter, but now feels coaxed through framing that doesn't feel so eminently soul-crushing. It's one of those collaboration projects where I do not expect any follow-through with anything else. Not the first time or only time this will show up on this list either, but you know, for a one-off experiment that is unlike anything else you'll hear this year, this was a strange garden of uncanny ideas, and one where I certainly enjoyed my wandering. Number 23. I know some folks are going to think it's close to heresy it's placed this high on this list. Or at the very least they'll say it's very revealing or telling of my taste. Or they might just say nothing. I tend to overthink these things, and I guarantee most people forgot this even came out in late 2021. But I don't care, screw it. This is Elbow's best album since the 2000s. I'm gonna praise it.
And the sun was the moon, and the moon was the sun, and the circle of fire. God's appalling eyeball on us, baby.
It's tough for me to place this album in context with Elbow's larger career, especially as it's not exactly as special as their progressive rock experimentation in the 2000s that culminated with The Seldom Seen Kid, an album that intentionally shares a title with a song on this new album. And you know, that might be the most revealing part of this project. The band might be starting to mine some of their own history or their own nostalgia, but the timbre of it is far smoother, liquid, and refined than they've really ever been, with simply gorgeous production to supplement that low-key arrangement as the band peels back all those layers of artifice to find some very middle-aged human emotions that still hit. Coming off of a decade where the band did feel lacking in any sense of coherent direction, to say nothing of their sound, Flying Dream 1 is the first time in a while where it feels like Elbow has felt cohesive, the hooks nailing the quiet complexity of their progressive roots, and the writing recapturing some of that ground-level humanity. It's an utterly beautiful surprise that as a longtime fan was a real treat to hear. If you like this streak of progressive or art rock, you might have still missed this. A lot of folks did, but you owe it to yourself for one of the most soothing listens of the past year. Again, it's beautiful. check it out. Number 22. In contrast, this album was the opposite of soothing. I mean, if you found catharsis out of it, those feelings are far more visceral and biting, and while I didn't initially think this would place this high for me, yeah, she did it again.
And all that I've learned is everything burns.
It's hard to talk about Lingua Ignota albums in terms of enjoyment. They're aiming to cleanse, to salve deep wounds, and then rip them open to bleed freely. And while Caligula will forever have a place for me, given how visceral and timely it was in my life, Sinner Get Ready with every added bit of context I discovered became a much closer second than I had previously realized. In my solo review of the album, I spoke at length surrounding my thoughts on religion and then faith, a lot of which shapes the liturgical foundations in this album's construction and potency, to say nothing of its utterly unique instrumental palette and production. But drill a little bit deeper, and you find a more layered wellspring of pain that encompasses righteous judgment, religious strictures used and abused to exploit and then absolve, and a yearning for salvation that would reveal the spirit and then purify in blood. It's always difficult to recommend Lingua Ignota albums, not just because of the sheer intensity, but also the context that informs a lot of them. It can get way too real. But I also know to a certain set of folks nearest to Protestant evangelical Christianity, this could be the most powerful thing they'll hear all year. And for the one who is not worthy for his name to be spoken, you'll face your judgment in time. In the meanwhile, on sight. Number 21. Okay, that was a lot. How about something paradoxically a little lighter, but nevertheless featured its own brand of relief and ecstasy?
Stop making this hurt. Say goodbye like you mean it. Stop trying on this hurt. Just say goodbye like you mean it. Say goodbye like you mean it.
You know, as a fan, I feel obliged to mention this is not better than Strange Desire. It's a lot messier, more ramshackle, does not have as strong of an ending, and you can argue it's even more wildly inconsistent than that messy debut. But Jack Antonoff somehow managed to wrangle his unabashed New Jersey love for Bruce Springsteen and Billy Joel into a careening shot of release that was stacked to the gills with hooks and enough self-awareness to both play the indulgent rock star and then savagely critique him at every single turn. This is immensely frustrating and frustrated album, returning home to unpack the angst, but also wanting to run wild in a time that nobody really can. And if Jack Antonoff could have fixed some of his glaring missteps in production, he could have had one for the absolute ages. In the meantime, though, it's got enough gleaming greatness to grow on me every step of the way across the past 6 or so months, and even if mainstream pop stans are sick of him, I don't see him going dark on me anytime soon. Number 20. I'm a little bit shocked this wound up as high as it did on this list, for a lot of similar reasons that Bleachers did, come to think of it. The flaws are obvious, it's certainly more shallow, and while it's her best album in nearly a decade, it's also the sort of return to roots that will not impress everybody, but when you stack it up with some of her best ever compositions and the bangers and the ballads...
Mother Nature's dying, nobody's keeping score. I don't wanna live in a man's world anymore. I don't wanna live in a man's world anymore.
The funny thing with this project from Marina is that initially I thought the piano ballads were by far the best parts of the album. Seriously, she's always had a tremendous voice and a command of her theatricality. She could capture so many evocative moments in just stripping it all down and letting her huge presence and real emotionality carry the load. But then you actually realize that her old school electropop songs kick a lot of ass too, and the entire album wound up balancing itself out. Yes, it's shallow. You could argue that the writing is very online leftist meets 2014 Tumblr core, and that leads to a couple missteps. But again, so what? She's got enough populism and firepower mostly to overcome her broader strokes, and I get the feeling that more were disparaging the messages on display for so many of the same reasons they crapped on Rise Against. That's not cool to care. Well, hate to break it to you here, but earnest and honest drive for real change tends to be a much better risk taken than ironic disaffection. And when this is as much style and flair to boot, yeah, I know where my allegiances will fall. This was great. Number 19. Honestly, when it comes to putting projects like this on my year-end list, I don't have to say that much. When the formula works this well for so long, not much needed.
I'm gonna walk through every doorway I can stop. I need some time, I need control, I need your love. I wanna find out everything I need to know.
Now, as I did say in the review, I think it's a slightly weaker War on Drugs album in comparison with their last couple. The production's a little less consistent, the writing is tilting towards cliche a little bit more obviously, and while I appreciate the poppier elements pulled in from 80s heartland rock, the cracks in that formula are starting to become a little bit more obvious. That being said, it's such a rock-solid formula, it's really damn hard for me to complain, especially when Adam Granduciel is going to use that poppier pivot to write a lot more immediate and striking songs, which is what he did here. And hey, call it the most obvious of white boy critic bait, it totally is, but when it soars this much, hard for me to take my eyes off the horizon. Gotta appreciate that. Number 18. Whereas this one, I'll admit I'm a little bit surprised at how much it got for me. Maybe it's my fondness for the B-listers who finally get a moment to cut loose. Maybe it's how she finally showcased the personality and potential to back up all the refinement and talent. Maybe it was just watching Music Row screw her over in one of the most insulting ways possible. Either way, it's Carly Pearce's best album to date. Write that in stone.
I bet you probably met him at a bar, let him walk you to your car. I bet he said he never falls this hard. Yeah, I remember that part.
Turns out all she needed was her marriage to implode for Carly Pearce to take that next step and improve across the board from an artist I could respect to one I genuinely like and want to see win here. And while I could praise the writing all goddamn day for finally showing more of that personality and bite that went along with her seasoned technical skills, where I think she won me over the most was her delivery. This was a project where the hard reality of the breakup and her recovery forced the performance to audibly crack, get a little bit more real. And when you couple it with the slap in the face of Music Row elevating her ex and giving him a hit for absolutely no discernible reason over the best hooks that she's had in her career, yeah, that gives this project a different sort of edge. It's an album of plans facing contact with a far less pliant or fair reality. And Carly Pearce proved strong enough to fight through that storm. Or so even if Big Machine couldn't rev things up to support it, I mean, I will. But sometimes when you have an avalanche, you just need to get out of the way. Number 17. So there's a lot of surprise on this list. I reckon this might be among the biggest though, mostly because I never would have predicted that it would work, especially not for the reasons that it does. But hey, if it turns out over a decade of their career, the band finds a way to fill a niche, and I wouldn't have expected this. Now, you could argue with Manchester Orchestra's 2017 album, there were glimpses this band was tapping into something special with their conceptual explorations of family drama, but the Million Masks of God took that messy territory and launched into the stratosphere at the intersection point of deaths and new beginnings. But more so than that, continuing to work with Catherine Marks and getting more hands-on in the production saw this band not just pull together some of their best ever hooks, but also the sort of desaturated swell and the vocal arrangements that kind of recall everything that Mumford & Sons tried to do after ditching folk, but were never able to bring the power or the nuance to bear. I think that's one reason this album stuck so strongly for me. It had density, but felt unpretentiously anthemic, where the smallest of moments actually felt huge and then earned their dramatic weight. The band is now touring with Foxing, and what might be one of the most inspired double bills I have seen in a long time. But even beyond that, Manchester Orchestra delivered a true stunner. What a surprise, what a find. Number 16. But while we're on the topic of out of nowhere stunners that I probably should have been on top of earlier and yet only continue to exceed expectations.
It was easier to say, stand for myself. It was easy to give in, stand for myself.
Yeah, I'm I'm kicking myself for not covering Yola's 2019 album that leaned a little heavier on country, and while I would argue at a time it was better for it, yeah, this was an album that grew on me so much, I'm not sure I could make that argument anymore. The soul flourishes are a lot more robust, the arc of the album feels more defined and more emotionally rich, the nuance of the self-repair journey actually expands into some interesting places, and Yola is the sort of powerhouse vocalist who is all the more potent with every new song she puts out. Yes, I want her working with a producer who is not named Dan Auerbach. Maybe give the arrangements a little bit more color, or hell, just have her as a standing member of the Highwomen. That makes all the sense in the world. It should be happening. But in the meantime, this was a strident and triumphant assertion of presence. You're out of excuses not to pay attention. This ruled. Number 15. So there are certain albums that win me over very quickly, especially from an artist I've been supporting the past couple of years and I've been really excited about. And then you try and follow up to see if they're getting the acclaim that you'd hope, and it's not really there, and the rationale as to why feels kind of flimsy. I did not expect to have to make a case to defend this project, but you know, if a proper pushback is needed, I can deliver. Jetty Bones' breakthrough on Rise Records does not have a gut punch as utterly devastating as Better, at least for me, I will admit that. But in every other element, this is the theatrical pop-emo fusion she seemed entirely prepared to deliver, and it's overflowing with colorful hooks, vibrant production, and content that gets way too real in its exploration of heartbreak, depression, and alcohol abuse. A searing juxtaposition that was, frankly, the underlying root of her appeal right from the very start. And yet, even if I would nitpick some production issues that are there, I was shocked by how many people recoil from all the pop elements here, or how her label seemingly mismanaged her sound. Yeah, it's perhaps a little bit more accessible, but it does feel like a natural continuation of where she was going, and it wasn't as if the writing lost any of its sting or flair, especially by the second half where even the most playful veneers are burned away and it gets real. Regardless, Jetty Bones made an album as catchy and therapeutic as ever. I hope to all graces she's in a good space, especially if it can help deliver more refined quality every step of the way, because she's on the right path. I want her to keep pushing. Number 14. But you know, while we're on the topic of pop-leaning pivots that didn't deserve nearly as much backlash as they got,
Don't you shy away. Manifest the ceiling when you shy away. Searching for that feeling just like an I love you. It isn't words. Like a song he wrote, it's never heard.
At this point, I feel like I've already run through my 21 Pilots talking points for the most polarizing, but in my opinion, most misunderstood project in their entire career. A pivot back towards their pop side that nevertheless sees Tyler Joseph confront messier questions in terms of legacy in the context of his family and the expectations that have been placed on this duo that rings as both a little bit more mature and a lot more bleak than many would actually notice. This is a quarantine album that almost seemed to appreciate the moments locked inside, untangling its obligations. For when the world opens up, it feels implacable, as the running metaphorical arc of Trench roars back to the forefront, and our duo here sees themselves pushed back to the very brink. And by that I mean the stage. It's an album that's as rich in metatext as the group has brought to bear since Blurryface, and while it's not quite as stacked to the gills as that album, it does feature the band as their tightest and arguably their sharpest. And it's a damn shame that so many just outright hated or misunderstood this album. I mean, what can I say? By scaling down, I think 21 Pilots grew up, and it's what made this work, should you actually choose to meet them there. Number 13. I think I've praised this album every chance I've gotten since I found it on Bandcamp, where the artist in question got enough attention that he was actually able to get a small vinyl pressing of this album, which of course I bought my copy. Thrilled to get it. I mean, when it sounds this good, you need that texture. Set the vibe.
You could be anyone, and that's the way you like it.
The Sophistopop of Tendon from Zero is easily one of the greatest underrated gems of 2021, and it ain't close. The production with its tasteful callbacks to the sleek sound of the mid to late 80s, but with enough maturity and refinement to actually feel contemporary to this time, backed up by the liquid delivery of Paul Dara, and the lyrics that know how to hit the precise balance in between class, taste, and the emotive fractures that reflect a man who is struggling to express himself within that space, with a lot of genuine tact and all the revealing moments where that tact just slips away and makes the album all the more human. It's gorgeously romantic and stylish, but never overplays his hand. This is an album that put me in my perfect comfort zone every time I heard it, at any time. It's my go-to chill album in 2021, and one that I cannot recommend highly enough. Number 12. One of the themes of this list has been artists for which I feel like I've been late to the party more than I probably actually have been. Now in this case, I've got some justification, as the artists that she's worked with here have not really impressed me all that much despite all the critical acclaim, so I just didn't really make the time. I didn't feel I had to. But in 2021 I did, and Lucy Dacus proved, even if I miss, she doesn't.
He can be nice sometimes. Other nights you admit he's not what you had in mind. All in all, nobody's perfect. There may be better, but you don't feel worth it.
I've mentioned this in passing before, but there's something about writing about Lucy Dacus's albums, especially this one, where words feel inadequate. That she's already perceptive enough to know what I would say, it just wouldn't be enough. So while I could go off about the layered and fascinating production detours, or how Dacus's alto gives the songs the gravitas and intensity to cut in both the romance and everywhere where that goes askew, or in how the balance of high emotional intelligence and perceptiveness clashes violently with her instincts to say too much and push things a little bit too far in a way that I found profoundly resonant and relatable, or simply how the scenes that she paints are so vivid, so flawed, so human that she leaves her peers grasping for this sort of impact. Either way, I'm kicking myself I wasn't into her music 5 years ago, and while Home Video is a difficult listen, it's profoundly rewarding. I'm not about to call you cerebral. You know what I mean. Number 11. But you know, while we're on the topic of folk-leaning songwriters with fascinating production that nevertheless expose all new layers of intensity to suck me in every time, 2 for 2, folks. They did it again.
I'm waiting for that call of the wild. I don't wanna fall this time.
At this point, I think Sundays might be my Bon Iver or Fleet Foxes, the indie pop folk act with strikingly great falsetto that'll get a mountain of critical acclaim, but are such a uniquely acquired taste, I completely understand if the emotional resonance is not connecting for you. And while this album does not have a Shape of the Pines, I do get why it might not strike as strongly. The moral ambiguity tilts even further as the justifications for artistic myopia hollow out even our frontman's relationships, even as he then comes to realize that he needs those connections to have any sort of compelling muse at all, an exercise in ego inflation and then deflation for which any artist can find some sort of resonance and relatability. But when you pair it with the gorgeously lush melodies, the striking vocal harmonies, the terrific grooves, and a few legit wonderful songs that still manage to soar, yeah, Sundays are still there for me. I can only dream to what coast they'll be heading next. Number 10. So here's a true story. I tried to get significant chunks of this album on my Gym's Common Workout playlist. Not sure it really worked. A lot of folks were thrown by the experience. Then they worked to swap it out the project with new Drake and Logic songs. Not kidding there. Which goes to show that if you ask me for stuff that's off the beaten path, I'm gonna give you material for which the majority are just not ready. I have the feeling that's on them though, not me, or this album.
Why would I pray for your health? Maybe I pray for myself. Why would I pay for your pit to go? I'm against somebody else. I'm against somebody better. Yeah, you just look at whoever. Yeah, yeah.
I get the impression that if JPEG Mafia and I were ever in a conversation for an extended period of time, we'd probably end up in a fist fight. And given that he was previously in the military, I would probably get my ass kicked. But I still think I would appreciate the confrontation, because I'd probably deserve it on some level. Because that is what LP is, offline or online. It wants to get in your face, challenge your expectations, get under your skin to make you actively uncomfortable, especially in gutting the soft underbelly of the phony machismo of mainstream hip-hop culture. But I appreciate just how much further JPEG Mafia will go, not just in how he takes his production cues from everywhere, while still manifesting a clear affinity in grounding things in classic rap music, but also how he'll bring his explosive tendencies to rip through the hypocrisy of fandoms, or even his underground peers who refuse to live the revolutionary spirit of their own rhymes. And while I am happy that the beef was squashed and JPEG Mafia still has a tendency to push things a little bit too far past reasonable taste, I refuse to complain that he actually does go that far, especially when he's proven that he's willing to back it all up in spades. Pick up the offline version, go for a burnout. Might sting a while, it's a burn though you'll appreciate. Number 9. So by sheer coincidence, this is the second country album on this list by an artist who's a little older, who took an extended break for 6 years, coming back to deliver what you might expect, but also so much more along the way.
Take my hand, Marie. Take a death grip on some part of me. Keep me from drifting far out to sea, or I'll be lost out there.
I mean, Jason Mercury is such an insanely good writer, it's hard not to be a little bit shocked when he comes back and he makes it all look so goddamn easy, picking up slightly faster tempos and a slightly sharper sense of urgency as he ruminates through midlife scenes of frustration, desperation, and real crisis, all the while with the sort of richly organic southern rock production that can match his cantankerous wit and his impeccable eye for detail. He's always been canny to avoid discussing the themes or autobiography when it comes to his albums, but I mean, it's certainly there in chronicling those who are getting older, feeling left behind in modern America, and how they might scrabble to find a shot of life or even just a bit of respite, where if it's political, it comes in extending humanity and empathy where it's rarely afforded, especially against businesses and institutions that have left them all behind, mostly through their own neglect. Either way, this album has already gotten plenty of rave reviews from those who actually know James McMurtry, who are in the know, and even if we only get an album every 5 or so years, hell, when it's this good, I'll take it. Number 8. So here's the thing with this next album. The last one represented a lot of country's past and legacy, and hell, there's a decent amount of projects like that on this list. This album also has some of that historical grounding, but also could stand for a better future, and man, what a thrill to see it realized.
Hold my dirt in a stuffy old church. Lord knows I didn't live by the letter. Just sing one of my songs from time to time.
Adeem the artist came right the hell out of nowhere for me, but it feels like an artist that deserves to be essential among indie country singer-songwriters, especially on the acoustic side. A good voice, an absolutely excellent command of atmosphere, especially in their production, and then there's the writing that hits this incredible balance of witty, charged, and genuinely heartfelt. I love how it feels rooted in some traditionalism, but also how country used to stand against the machine. That's part of their history too, and it should be inclusive of those who are queer or further to the left than anyone else who's currently getting attention, because again, that's part of country's history and legacy as well. Not just a reclamation of their own identity, but how country itself has that pedigree, and they can take a stand to amplify that, and then do so overflowing with charm, humor, and even genuine romance. It's worth noting that Adeem the artist was able to crowdfund their next album. Looks to be a bit more of an involved affair, but hell, if Cast Iron Pansexual was just setting the scene, we could have something very special coming down that pipeline. I'm ready to hear it. Number 7. The more I reflect on this album, it's not that it just destroys everything in its path with wild, rancorous abandon. It's like, with Adeem the artist, it shows all the promise of the world that can come after that storm. Sometimes you need the bulldozer and the Molotov cocktail, especially when from the inferno, we get this.
Everything that didn't kill me,
Full disclosure, this was not an everyday album for me, but when it hits this hard, in the right moments, there was nothing I could compare. A feedback loop of self-flagellation and systemic injustice that only built off the grooves to this cyclonic nightmare that was difficult to escape, where agony was his own cathartic reward, but also exposed the raw nerves of somebody who was pushed to that brink. And when paired with her best ever hooks, bars, production, and a streamlined focus to showcase so many varied sides of industrial rap metal, while brushing through noise, African music, and even post-rock, yeah, Backwash's newest project doesn't just pulverize everything it touches, but showcases the endless potential for growth and experimentation. And at this point, oh shit, I just want to see this and experience it live. It fucking slays. Number 6. You know, I said earlier this year, odds were high this EP would wind up on streaming services eventually, and it didn't happen. I mean, I got my vinyl pressing, and I've been able to stream through its proprietary service whenever I want, and that's been great. But come on, Eric Church, stop hiding the best thing you've ever made. It's getting annoying.
Spend my living giving thanks for the ships I've never sank. Every big, every little, and the everyday things. The notes and the words and the songs I sing to the ones doing life with me.
So yeah, Eric Church's And EP might be the first album ever to make my year-end list that's only available for distribution in the most siloed and restrictive ways possible. His fan club proprietary streaming service and an exceptionally limited vinyl pressing. And yeah, for 6 songs, it's concentrated wonderful. The sort of alternative country that would make the fans who know the diehards, who get a sample of Eric Church's some of his best production and vocals and writing to date, where almost on its own it redeems the goofy package with a double album, heart and soul. But so few have actually heard the damn thing, and Eric Church seems content to keep it very exclusive, and by some miracle, none of the fans have actually leaked it. And I can't ask anyone to really shell out a decent chunk of change for an EP that might appeal to more, but no guarantees. I don't know, maybe he didn't think EMI Nashville would promote it properly. Probably a likely assumption. Or maybe he's just committed to a trust with his fandom that's persisted better than I think anybody could imagine in the age of the internet. But for those who have heard it, the And EP is a marvel. The best thing mainstream country has produced in goddamn years. At least for me. Worth being a fan to catch the magic. Number 5. So here's an observation. I have never placed a black metal album this highly on my year-end list before now. But the more listens I gave this thing, yeah, such raw, transcendent beauty deserves this pedestal. When I first reviewed Unrequited back in 2020, I knew the artist was on the cusp of greatness. The symphonic swells of black metal, they were striking and pretty as all hell, just need a little more structure, slightly stronger tunes, slightly more refined production, just that added step in putting it over the top, and Beautiful Ghost is precisely that. You don't need to be able to make out the distant screams in order to trace the arc at one's ending, crossing the bridge beyond space and time to whatever might come and then to reconnect, especially when the riffs maintain the texture and tune with the best of them, and the melodic crescendos can feel both wildly dynamic and profoundly satisfying. It's a project of such striking beauty that I'm almost a little bit tentative to recommend it to the raw black metal fans. It's really goddamn pretty, damn near to a fault. But when the coursing melodies can grab your heartstrings this powerfully, it showcases the epic, almost gothic power of this genre that is unlike anything else. It's utterly miraculous, where even if you might be put off by the visceral nature and sound of this genre, still stunning, it's worth the journey. Number 4. You know, you hear about the collaborations that might be obvious, they might even drop a good single, and you're left thinking it might be a good idea to ask for more, but how often have we seen the moment work for a moment, nothing else? Especially if it's a stylistic diversion for both the artist. And Lord help you if you want to actually sell copies to the mainstream public beyond the diehard fans, especially if both acts have slightly different levels of fame and fan bases. So even when I heard the first shots of this collaboration, I almost didn't want to ask for more, I didn't want to wish, but yet...
Smoking out the window, singing, how could she do this to me? How could she do this to me? Oh, I thought that girl belonged to
throwback. Call it cheesy beyond measure. Call it a goof where the theatricality doesn't quite capture all the organic imperfections of the era, and then call it a one-off experiment for good measure. All that might be true, and yet it doesn't make An Evening with Silk Sonic any less concentrated wonderful. A career highlight for both Bruno Mars and Anderson .Paak that might stand among the best things they have made to date. It's absolutely dripping with retro affection for soul, R&B, funk, and blues, the understanding of the melodic textures and grooves to make it all materialize. They nothing of the attitude and the swagger to walk the line between sincerity and parody or cheesiness. But what I think makes the album actually work best is the content, which is just tastefully updated for the modern era, just enough to make it not as far afield as many people would expect. Yeah, I don't expect them to do anything more with this after they tour and win a Grammy or two, and they better win those Grammys. But in all due honesty, I'm fine with this being a one-off, them capturing that vibrant moment and giving us all another great soulful bedroom record for all sorts of adult activities. But it's easily one of the most enjoyable wins of 2021, where for once the fans and critics were mostly in alignment that this was fantastic. And as soon as I get the damn thing pressed on vinyl, the better off we'll all be. Number 3. Even being very comfortable with this album as high as it is on my list, I'm kind of legit shocked that it is. I'm shocked I found lightning in a bottle like this. The sort of album that fits within the indie, pop, rock, emo trends that are rising right now. Clearly echoing back to the 2000s, but also one that feels like it's head and shoulders above everyone, and nobody's quite caught up just yet. And for a debut as well, almost like she hit a bullseye for something. There's a lot I could unpack with Charlie Adams in this album. The emotional breadth and depth of the heartbreaks and therapeutic examination of her past and present straits, the husky expressiveness with the real sweetness that can pull you in even as the edge is just below the surface, to how the rock elements and grooves course beneath the gauzy synths and the glittery hooks that might have so much restraint but never fail to pull me in, where if there are some psychedelic touches, they only underscore the emotional wellspring that is on display with so much nuance and clarity. But it does go deeper. Not only does the album feel contemporary with any of Charlie Adams' peers, but it carries an emotional maturity and a self-awareness that penetrate beyond just the sheer scope of adolescence. It might feel younger, but the resonance never does. The sort of project that I would call subtle if the writing didn't bleed so freely and capture scenes with so much nuanced reality and such an eye for detail. In my opinion, Charlie Adams should be mentioned among the great wave of women in pop and rock and emo who are pulling in old sounds to shape this new reality, because across this varied but very tightly knit project, she delivered among the very best of it. You probably missed this too. Check it out. Number 2. Ever since this album was announced, I knew in my gut it would be the project to beat this year. I mean, call it confidence, but I knew what this artist was capable of delivering, and I had all the faith in the world that she would deliver, even with the stiffest competition she's faced to date. And, again, 2 for 2, and this time it seemed like the doors began really opening for her. And for damn good reason.
Lightning in a bottle, if only I had known I'd be back here after 20 years, driving down this road, wondering where that girl is gone and how to bring her back, missing life when it was easier, and love when it was magic.
I've been cheerleading for Emily Scott Robinson since 2019, and while I don't think American Siren is quite as consistent as Traveling Mercies, the high points there are on a different playing field. More importantly, this was an album that felt like a breakthrough for her. The production felt more lush and layered and settled in itself. Robinson's writing picked up more texture and form, and her singing, it's the best it's ever been. I don't like relying on statements like the talent is self-evident, but there is such a potency to her presence and her ear for lyrical meter and her flair for transgressive detail that even those that I showed who don't like country they wound up with some grudging appreciation for it. They saw that quality on display. But for an album that's all about losing the ribs of religion to find the heartbeat of faith and passion, when we're actually suggested a pairing with Lingua Ignota's Sinner Get Ready, and I stand by how that makes so much more sense than you might think. Emily Scott Robinson saw a pickup by a larger label, and she got her budget, and finally more folks are paying attention. The rest of the world is finally starting to pay attention to one of the most talented songwriters of this generation, who has a humility and grace to deliver on it with texture and empathy, and also one of the most striking country folk albums of 2021 along the way. Again, this was a standout. You need to hear it. And finally, number 1. I don't want to say it was no contest. In the last months of 2021, it absolutely was a very open question what would get this slot. But at the end of the day, the first time I heard this guy on Bandcamp, I was floored. Another artist completing a trilogy with the most varied color and experimentation to date, where I don't often get shocked on first listen that much anymore, but he pulled it off. And by now, anyone who knows will recognize exactly these.
Lost my nigga, so now my heart has a divot. The braids in the back of my head finna probably pivot. Mama says this life gon' follow you as long as you was living quiet. God bless it. Lost my nigga, so now my chest has a divot. The braids in the back of my head finna probably pivot. Mama says this life gon' follow you as long as you was living. She sings. God bless it.
McKinley Dixon made the sort of album that is excellent across so many dimensions that if this had the marketing push of when TDE and Aftermath was behind To Pimp a Butterfly, this would wind up in similar conversations. I don't make that comparison lightly. McKinley Dixon is a rapper who can bend and find a pocket damn near anywhere against a vibrantly organic palette of southern-inflected jazz rap instrumentals where only the best could really ride these, and he makes it sound conversational. The sheer ability to change up his flow and command melody and bend across genre and then ring out guest performances that all fit the thematic arc, that would be one thing. Actually, it's a lot of things, all of them amazing, but then we get to that content, we get to that material, building off the context established with his first 2 albums in order to unpack layers of personal and societal trauma with a breathtaking sense of ambiguity, empathy, and dimensionality. It's certainly one of the most thoughtful and comprehensive takes on religion I have heard in rap music that goes so far beyond the chains of leadership or the aspirations to any sort of heavenly wings, because McKinley Dixon knows everything else that comes along with them. It might be cavalier in its bravado and rooted in the sort of reference points that any die-hard nerd will really appreciate, a lot of great nuggets and Easter eggs here, but also a powerful note of healing and a ritual among communities that, well, shuns religion, finds faith among family and heritage that's about as organic and emotive as it comes. Oh, and also happens to bang like nobody's business, and it's overflowing with wit and melodic hooks for days. So while there is pain exposed here, there's also a salve and a bandage to staunch that bleeding. And for me in 2021, handily best album of this past year. 2022, you got your work cut out for you. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. Yeah, I know my voice is kind of fried, still recovering, I'm working on it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to share your list of the best albums of the year, what you think they are, links down there, have them in the comments, have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to help support the channel, well, first off, I got a link for merch. I'd be happy if you guys want to jump in. Or if you want to help support the channel longer term, get into arguments with me on my Discord, maybe get albums onto my schedule for the year ahead, link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated right now. Tough times, I understand, but options available. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.